A couple of announcements before we introduce our guests and begin our program tonight. We have 2 more sessions after this of our conversation on the College of Jewish Studies. Next week, which is the 15th of February, right? Next week, our guest will be Professor Miriam Glazer, who's going to be talking to us about Israeli literature since 1967. We're going to open some of the most important writers, novelists, and poets who have reflected about Israel, Israel's character, Israel's life since 1967. Most of this literature is unavailable to Americans because it's in Hebrew, and unless your Hebrew is very good, it's difficult to get to. And Miriam has her own translations of this stuff, and it's a wonderful opportunity to open books that we normally don't get a chance to open. So please come next week. And then the closing session will be the following week, which is the 22nd. And we're going to be talking, it's called Tomorrow's Zionism. And we're going to split the session between Professor Zakkai, who is the leading Israel educator in Los Angeles, and then a panel discussion with her, with Aaron Lerner, who's the rabbi at UCLA Hillel, and with a group of UCLA Hillel students who are part of the Bruins for Israel organization, talk about both what it's like to represent Israel on college campuses today, as well as how young people are thinking about Israel. And that'll be our closing session for the college. However, there's actually an extra session that was just added through the courtesy of my dear friend Michael Waterman. Ambassador Chaim, they can't hear me? I get no kick from champagne. The first Shabbat in March, which I think is March 3rd, 4th, 3rd? The first Saturday morning in March. I have it here. 4th. Our guest that morning will be Ambassador Chaim Koren, who is formerly Israel's ambassador to Egypt. And he's here visiting his daughter, who works next door at USY. But we snagged him for a Shabbos morning. So he's going to come talk to us first about what it's like to be Israel's representative in a Muslim country, in Egypt, and more than that, how Israel and the Arab world are getting along. And he promised to share some secrets with us. So come that Shabbos morning. So all of these sessions, and many more yet to come, helping us understand what Israeli life is like today. A couple of other announcements quickly. Friday night is Shabbat Shira, the Sabbath celebrating Jewish music. This year we celebrate the music of Michael Isaacson, who is a member of our community, usually sits in that row back there, very large gentleman, who is the greatest living composer of liturgical music in the Jewish world. He has written, on the occasion of his retirement, written a Friday night service, all original music. It's being performed in 25 synagogues around the country. We're one of them. Come Friday night, 8 o'clock. Be prepared to hear some beautiful new music that goes along with the prayers of the Friday night service. It's free, and there will be brownies. And then every Shabbos morning, of course, Torah study at 9 o'clock. And next Friday night is the Rimonim service, the beautiful musical service at 6:30. That's all the announcements I can think of. I'm sure there's many more. And a couple of other quick announcements. Today is the day Bill Kabacher entered the world. Yom Huledet Sameach, Yom Huledet Sameach, Yom Huledet Sameach, Yom Huledet Sameach. Happy birthday, Billy! Please rise from your seats, turn to the folks beside you and say, hi, welcome, it's good to have you here. Now, we are an affectionate synagogue, so put your arms about those people and draw them close. In just a moment, don't sit down, stand up. You're in shul, you need to stand. You need to get the blood down to your toes and up to your nose. Put your arms around each other, get them close. Ready? In just a moment, I'm going to introduce to you the new Consul General of the State of Israel, Los Angeles, and Western states. If you have a sense of Jewish history, if you know Jewish history, you don't take a thing like that for granted. The Consul General of a Jewish country who comes to Los Angeles to share with us news of the Jewish people in its own land. That's, if you know Jewish history, that's worth a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu, v'kiyamanu, v'giyanu, lazman. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Stay right where you are. Don't sit down yet. First, a very big thank you to a very dear soul who doesn't hear thank you enough. Carolyn, who is the public affairs officer in the consulate, has been so good to this synagogue and to all of us. Our dear friend, thank you so much. Thank you. And now it is my distinct and wonderful pleasure to welcome the new Consul General of the State of Israel to Western States of the United States, Mr. Sam Grunwald. Make yourself at home. Please take a seat. These microphones were created in an anti-Semitic country. So you have to put it right up to you. In fact, it's better to actually hold it up against your mouth. Okay. Otherwise, these good Jews are going to scream at you and tell you that they can't hear a word you say.
Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
There you go. You got it. You see? That's how you defeat the anti-Semites. We have many, many issues. I'm going to make sure that everyone knows, for housekeeping purposes, the Consul General has to catch a late flight to Miami tonight. So he's going to only be with us till about 8:30. So we're not going to take a coffee break. We'll take the coffee break at the end. We're going to go right through to 8:30, and then I'm going to ask you to stay in your seat so he and his driver can get outside and get to the airport so he isn't late for his flight. Tell us about you. You don't speak with an Israeli accent, Epis. So tell us about your story, how you came to be our Consul General. Where are you from and how'd you get here?
I will. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you, your amazing team here. I'd like to thank all of you for taking time during the week to come out and to hear me and to meet me. I'm really excited to be here. It's my cousin Doug Workman who's here, a member of your synagogue. First of all, I want to share with you that I almost didn't make it tonight, Rabbi. You didn't know this, but just to show you how important it was for me to be here. We were on our way over here and made a little stop to take care of some things, and a woman approached us and asked us if we were fans of Sting. Apparently he's performing tonight, and offered us some tickets. So of course we looked at each other and said, well, what would Rabbi Feinstein say?
Here's what you do. You come to VBS and give Rabbi Feinstein the Sting tickets. And that...
So that crossed our minds, but I was more comfortable with you asking the questions and leading the discussion. So we turned down the Sting concert tickets to be here. No, really, first of all, it's a true story. But I'm really pleased to be here with you. I'm happy to hear that you don't sense a Hebrew accent, because the truth is, altogether now, I've lived in Israel for something like 15 years. On and off. I was back and forth a little bit in between, and I have been told at times that I have a Hebrew accent, so I'm glad to hear that. I was born and raised in Miami Beach, Florida. That's where I grew up, and I moved to Israel on my own right after high school at the age of 17. I spent 8 years there in that first stretch. I studied in yeshiva for a couple of years. And then I went into the Army. I served in the IDF, in the Israeli Defense Forces. I was a tank gunner in a combat unit as a lone soldier. But it's interesting. There's a lot more awareness today about lone soldiers than there used to be back then. We're talking more than 25 years ago when I served. And the truth is, I lived in a wonderful community and had a lot of support by many families, to the extent that it was myself and another lone soldier from England. It was just the two of us, and the rest were Israelis. To the extent that we would usually come home about once every 2 weeks, with very dirty clothing from the Army. And there were so many families, thank God, that wanted to look after us that we literally had to empty out all the dirty laundry and split it up into different piles to spread the love with the families that wanted to help us. So that was a very good experience. And then I did my undergraduate studies at Bar Ilan University in Ramat Gan. And initially, coming out of school, I worked in finance. I worked for Strauss Dairies for a few years, for 3 years in Petah Tikva. And then family circumstances brought us back to Florida, to South Florida. This is the late 90s. And we ended up staying, we didn't know how long we were going to stay for, ended up staying for 11 years. And I continued at first working in finance, while in the evening I studied and I did an MBA, a master's in business administration and finance at the University of Miami. And then I changed directions, which would become a little bit of a theme in my professional career. And I studied law at the University of Miami and ended up working as a transactional real estate lawyer for 5 years in South Florida for a very large firm called Greenberg Traurig, which many of you probably know, and Doug knows. And then came back to Israel in 2009 as a returning citizen with the family and changed directions again, and I was brought into the World Jewish Congress, which many of you I'm sure have heard of, but if you haven't, it's a global Jewish organization headed up by Ronald Lauder, son of Estee Lauder, based in New York, dealing in diplomacy, Jewish communities around the world, also supporting Israel. So I served as their executive director in Israel for the World Jewish Congress Israel, based in Jerusalem, dealing a lot with things outside of Israel, with communities and members of parliament and ministers and governments and government members and international organizations, but also a large part of my role was inside Israel, maintaining the relationships with the relevant Israeli government offices, starting with the Prime Minister's office, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which I'm now a part of, but then I was dealing with them from the outside, and others. And so a lot of close relationships were established during those 6 years. And then about a little over a year ago, I was approached by the Prime Minister and his office for this appointment, which was not necessarily something that I would have guessed if you asked me a couple years ago, going in this direction. And so I'm what's considered a political appointment, meaning not a career diplomat who came up through the ranks of the foreign ministry. But the way it works in Israel anyway is that, which is different than the way it is here, is that every foreign minister, and the prime minister, as you know, as many of you know, is also the foreign minister today. Every foreign minister in Israel has 11 political appointments that he or she can use. In any, they're not tied to specific postings, but they can have 11 political appointments at any time, and I'm one of those 11. So it's kind of a long answer to a short question.
And your family? Give us the whole picture. You have a wife,
Sure.
beautiful wife.
I have a beautiful wife. We've been married now almost 24 years, and we got married young.
Yeah.
And we have 3 kids. We have a boy and 2 girls. Our son is just later this month turning 19, so he graduated high school. He stayed in Israel. He's in the Hesder Yeshiva program, Shalavim, which is a program that is a mixture of studying in yeshiva and military service. So he's now halfway through his first year of a 5-year program. At this point, he's been in the yeshiva part, and in about a year, next March, he's scheduled to go into the IDF. And then we have 2 girls, 17-year-old and a almost 15-year-old, so 11th grader and 9th grader. The 11th grader was also in Israel. She did come with us in the summer, in August when we came. We came with 2 out of the 3 kids, but after the holidays, after Sukkot, you know, she was at a difficult age, Rabbi, for, as you can imagine, where she's almost an adult but still a kid, and so she really didn't want to come from the beginning. It was interesting when I remember when I was finally able to share with her about my appointment. You know, I remember coming home and I told her I was appointed by the Prime Minister, and she stood across from me and she put her hands on my shoulders and she said, "Abba, I'm proud of you, but I'm not coming with you." And
she's an Israeli. Yeah.
Israeli.
Right.
She did come with us in August, like I said. We kind of put our foot down or our feet down. But she really wanted to be there and had to be there. So after Sukkot, I brought her back to Israel. She's living with a family, not relatives, because my wife and I don't have parents living in Israel. So she's living with a family that we're very close with. They also made Aliyah from Cleveland. And it's difficult, and we miss her, and she misses us, but she's doing well, and she's definitely where she needs to be. And we have our youngest, who's 15 almost, and in 9th grade, and she's here with us. She goes to Eula, and she's doing well. She misses Israel, she misses her sister and brother, but she's certainly enjoying her time here in LA.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks so much. I think it's important to know the human side of this, and to know that we're going to talk about diplomacy and peace and war in a few minutes. This gentleman has a son in the military, right? You talk about putting your commitment up front. So let's begin with many, many questions I want to ask, but let's begin with what was in the headlines this very week. This very week, the headlines told us that a bill had passed the Knesset, and the bill had something to do with regularizing the status of settlements that had at one point been deemed illegal because they may or may not be on private Palestinian land. Those who were in favor of the bill seemed to say this is an expression of Israeli sovereignty, and those who were against the bill said this is theft. So first of all, tell us what this bill is, and as my Bubby used to say, why is this good for the Jews?
Thank you. I'm actually glad you asked that question, because it is important, and I think that it's not really being covered in an accurate way in the media. It's important to understand here. I'm also going to put on my real estate lawyer hat a little bit, because it's important, like many things relating to Israel and the Middle East, not just to consume your knowledge only from the headlines, but sometimes you have to roll up your sleeves and drill down and get into the details and to understand things. There's no question that the bill is controversial, and let me start at the end by saying that there's a pretty good chance that it'll be struck down. You know, in Israel, even though it was passed by the Knesset and it had to go through a first reading and a second reading, and it did pass, there's still the Court of High Justice, what they call it in Israel, the Bagatz, Beit Din Gadol Tzedek, and there's a process, and you probably also read that the Attorney General has come out against the bill, and there's going to be a petition to the Court of High Justice. And so let me start by saying that even though it's created a lot of noise and debate, and there's been a lot of outcry, for those of you who identify with that, kind of the good news here is if in fact it gets struck down, that means that the system works. You could talk about a more efficient process and a less efficient process, but this law may not survive. Now, what is this law all about? It's being unfairly spun by some as legalizing theft and just allowing Israel to quote unquote continue to steal land and displace the Palestinians. That's not true. What one has to understand, and you touched on, I think, most of the points, is it's a lot more narrow than it's being described. What this law does, it addresses structures or houses, buildings that were inadvertently, and you have to show this for the law to apply, that were inadvertently built on private property, meaning that you have to show, that's number one. You have to show that that these structures were mistakenly built. In other words, the law does not apply if it was intentionally built on private property. Number two is it has to be in cases where there was government assistance. And you know, there's a lot of talk about numbers of how many properties this would apply to, and it's much less than one would think. You know, there are laws like this. It's important to point out. There's been so much noise being made about it here because it's in the territories. There are laws like this all over the world and other places, and also in what's considered Israel proper. But what's happened is, because it's in an area where there's a dispute over the land, so for all of these decades, there's been a complete vacuum and ambiguity with respect to certain properties. We're not talking, by the way, I don't remember the percentages, but we're not talking about properties or buildings that were built very recently. We're talking about a lot of structures that have been standing for decades and decades, and there's just been this kind of limbo or really ambiguous area within the law. So there was a need here because of a vacuum in order to make seder, to make order, which is why it's called the Chok HaHasdara. And so it's important to put into. I'm not sitting here trying to explain that it's not controversial. It is controversial, but the extent of it is nowhere near as what the way that it's being described. And like I said, there's a good chance, and indications are that it won't survive.
So if I'm a Palestinian landowner and an Israeli settlement spilled over into my land, and I'm suing the settlement and suing the government of Israel because that shopping center is now on my land, do I lose here? Do I gain here? What does this law do for me?
So what the law says also is that it deals with providing compensation to the private landowner whose property was inadvertently developed upon, and it actually provides for compensating at a rate of 125% of what's considered to be the market value.
125. That's a
Right.
good deal. Not a bad deal.
25% more.
Above market value.
Right.
So the part of the problem, it seems to me, as an outsider reading the newspaper in the morning, is that you just had a major United Nations Security Council vote having to do with settlements, and now you have a headline where it seems like the Israeli Knesset has said to those, to the United Nations at least, this is our intention. So let's step back and look at that UN vote for a minute.
Yes.
It seemed the Prime Minister obviously was rather incensed, as were many friends of Israel. But the interesting thing was that 14 countries, including some countries that have pretty good relations with Israel, Senegal, for example, New Zealand, voted for it. What's the deal there? And what effect does that United Nations, that Security Council vote have on Israel, Israel's fate, Israel's behavior? Was it really a problem for Israel? And one more question. Why do you suppose so many countries that otherwise have goodwill toward Israel voted in favor of that bill?
All good questions.
Thank you.
But we could do the whole hour, by the way, just on that. So I'll try to cover a lot of ground quickly.
Yeah.
So first, let me take a step back. The rabbi's talking about the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2334 that was passed on December 23rd, where the United States did not use its veto right and abstained, and the other 14 countries, as the rabbi said, voted in favor. And it's true that the reaction from Israel was a very strong one, starting with the Prime Minister, with my colleague, our ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, who I'm sure many of you heard and saw on the media, all over the media. By the way, Ron is also from Miami Beach. I don't know if you know that. The reason why we reacted as strongly as we did is because the effect of the resolution. First of all, the resolution really was a significant departure from decades of U.S. policy, and for the following reason: what the resolution did was it took the issue of settlements, which is an important issue, and which is an issue that it's absolutely legitimate to have different opinions about, and it's absolutely legitimate to negotiate over and to argue about. And it's also an issue that Israel has shown it's willing to make compromises and painful sacrifices over. But it took that issue and made that issue paramount and absolutely separated it from all of the other issues. And what it also did was it kind of prejudged the conclusion already with respect to the status of the land by the language that was in that resolution and talking about occupied Palestinian territory, and also having the way that it was worded to include the Western Wall and the Old City of Jerusalem. So when you prejudge that outcome and you take away really any kind of negotiating position for Israel, you undermine the whole process. And what it also does is it takes away any incentive of the Palestinians to actually come to the negotiating table and negotiate directly. And it rewards them, in effect, for doing an end run and internationalizing the dispute by showing that they can come to organizations such as the UN and others, rather than coming to the negotiating table, which is what we've been asking for over and over, and negotiating directly between the two parties over the issues, with the settlements being one of them, but not the only issue, and the fact that it was so one-sided. Now, in terms of the effect of it, you asked, it has more of a political effect than a legal effect. It's a little bit technical here, but with the United Nations Security Council, it can be more binding if if a resolution is passed under what's called Chapter 7. This was not necessarily Chapter 7, it was passed under Chapter 6. It would be possible in the future to make it more binding, so the effect of it being binding is not as extensive as it can be, but it certainly has a political effect because the resolution was passed, it's in effect. Also, with respect to what paragraph number 5 in the resolution, calling for distinguishing between what it refers to as Israel proper and the rest of the territory, and really encouraging boycott and really serving as a tailwind to the whole boycott movement. That's the other part of it that's so troubling. Mm-hmm. And really, so for those reasons, Israel reacted as strongly as we did. The disappointment that we had in the fact that the United States, the Obama administration, did not use its veto power for those reasons. Now, with respect to the last question that you asked about it, which is a very interesting one and a fair one, in terms of, how could it be on the one hand, if you look at some of the bilateral, meaning one-on-one relationships, diplomatic relationships that some of these countries have with Israel, which seem to be good or improving on the one hand, but yet in these group voting situations, we see a ganging up on Israel. There is a gap. There is kind of a dissonance there, and there are a lot of reasons why. First of all, in each body, like the UN, they have their own internal politicking reasons. In other words, there are all kinds of different committees and internal favors that need to be bargained and traded for, because this country wants to be on this committee and wants to be on that committee. So there's all kinds of horse trading, if you will, that goes on behind the scenes at a place like the UN. Interestingly, just last week, I was in San Diego, and our ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, was there, and he and I met, and I had a chance to meet with him privately, and he speaks about this, about how what he calls the two UNs. There's the UN that we all see, in the public proceedings and in these votes, and then there's what goes on behind the scenes, in the hallways or in the different corridors or offices. And he was explaining to me, which even to me as his colleague, Israeli diplomat, but not in that setting, was very eye-opening, about how, a lot of times when there are several countries involved, so they kind of have to treat Israel a certain way. But what we're and I think it's a gap that's gonna, I don't know that it'll completely disappear, but it's a gap that will close. But what we see on the bilateral one-on-one relationships, and we see this all the time, especially in Israel, where, by the way, the countries and heads of state and foreign ministers continue to just sweep in to Jerusalem. They come in every week. They're being hosted by the prime minister, by the president at the King David Hotel. And I could tell you that nobody is twisting their arms to come visit Israel. And what is often talked about behind closed doors in these meetings, besides, of course, concerns, and there could be disagreements over different policy issues, but at the end of the day, these countries want to be closer to Israel because a lot of what Israel has to offer. We've become Israel, and we, all of us in this room, as the pro-Israel community and as part of the Jewish nation, have a lot to be proud of in terms of why all these countries are seeking out these close relationships with Israel, because we become a leader in the world where countries are seeking our technology, whether it's cybersecurity, water technology, agriculture, fighting terrorism. You know, in today's world, we have Arab countries that don't even have formal diplomatic relationships with Israel, you know, because of the realignment in the region, with the threat of Iran and with the chaos in the Middle East around Israel, where the more moderate or less radical Sunni Arab states have become closer, again, maybe not formally, but in terms of contact and collaboration. These countries, they're aggressively seeking out Israel's knowledge and expertise and know-how for all of these things. So these countries really want to get closer. That doesn't mean that there isn't sometimes a disconnect with the way that the group voting takes place in fora like the UN. But I think over time, that's going to change, and the gap will
So
get wider.
let's move beyond that specific vote to the much broader issue and much longer term issue of what are the prospects for a peaceful resolution? Okay, for a long time we've talked about a two-state solution. The Prime Minister gave a very famous speech at Bar-Ilan University, where he came out in favor of a two-state solution, and my understanding is that's currently the stated policy goal of the State of Israel. So I was listening to the radio the other day, and your colleague Dani Dayan, who is the Consul General of the State of Israel in New York City, formerly the head of the Yesha Council, he was the head of the Settlers Council in Israel, he's being interviewed by David Remnick, who's the editor of the New Yorker magazine. And Dayan, who speaks very, very good English, by the way, said very clearly, the two-state solution is dead. It's never going to happen. And Remnick was kind of surprised by this and kept asking him questions like, well, but you have 2.5 million Palestinians. What are you going to do with them? And then this morning in Haaretz, in response to the bill of the Knesset, Abbas, who's the current leader of the Palestinian Authority, said the same thing. This kills the two-state solution. So here's my question. Is the two-state solution dead? Is it still something that the State of Israel aspires to, hopes for? If the State of Israel hopes to have a two-state solution, why are you building settlements where one day there will be a Palestinian state? What is your vision, or the Prime Minister's vision, of how this is going to ever end?
First of all, I'm so glad, Rabbi, that as you told me before, you're only going to ask me easy questions.
I know,
So
listen.
I'm so pleased that...
you know.
No, that's a very fair question. First of all, in terms of Dani Dayan, who's my colleague, he is the Consul General in New York. In terms of answering for him, I'm not going to try to explain. If he said, I didn't hear it and I didn't read it, but I'm sure what you're saying is based on fact. If he said that the two-state solution is dead, he had to have been speaking from his own opinion and not as an Israeli diplomat representing the government of Israel. Now, it is a little bit difficult to follow because even as you say, that this seems to be the vision or the position of the State of Israel. You know, it's complicated. We have, it is the vision, I can tell you this, it is the vision of the Prime Minister, and it continues to be the vision of the Prime Minister. You know, we are in a coalition government, right? So it means that there are 120 seats in the Knesset. We have a coalition and we have an opposition, and even the coalition, right, which is the ruling parties that make up the government, are made up of different parties with different opinions. That are this government is certainly more of a right-of-center government, but even within that right-of-center government, you have within the coalition a center, a right, and even a left. So, for example, the position of Naftali Bennett, who's a minister in the government, he's part of the cabinet, he's the education minister and the minister of diaspora affairs, he clearly does not subscribe to the position of a two-state solution. So when we say it's the position of the State of Israel, that's not exactly accurate. It's the position of the Prime Minister, and he's the head of this government, but not every member of this government or of this coalition is a party to that position. So speaking now as a diplomat here in the Southwestern United States and answering your question from the point of view of the Prime Minister, the prime minister has, and by the way, the defense minister Lieberman, who, according to some, was seen to be more of a hawk. One of the first things that the Minister of Defense Lieberman said when he was sworn as defense minister was echoing his commitment to the vision of a two-state solution. The prime minister has reiterated his commitment to a two-state solution, and that continues to be the position of the prime minister. Now, getting from there and how we get there, and I was asked about this not long ago about whether I can really be optimistic about this. I always try to point and remind people about the peace treaties that we have with Jordan and with Egypt, and especially with Egypt. By the way, this year we're going to be marking 40 years since the Sadat visit in Israel, which is really a significant thing. Yeah. It really is, and maybe I'll talk about this a little bit later. There are a whole bunch of different kind of jubilee events that we're going to be marking during the course of 2017, and that's one of them. I think to a certain extent we take for granted those peace deals, especially the one with Egypt, where just a few years before Sadat himself, was the leader of that country, and the bloody attacks and losses between Israel and Egypt on both sides. I'm sure, and I know that before that courageous peace was reached, it also seemed like it was something that was impossible. And what it took was courageous leaders on both sides and courageous people and nations on both sides. And I think that's the situation today. I think, again, I'm not explaining what Danny Dayan may have said. I certainly do understand the pessimism, even according to those who are committed to a vision of a two-state solution, like myself and like the Prime Minister, about how the conditions today don't seem conducive to it. But that doesn't mean that we can't get there. I think that, look, the leadership on the Palestinian side is expected to change at some point in the future. Abbas, besides the fact that his age and his health, he also, from a practical standpoint, doesn't really have a mandate. There haven't been elections there for some 10 years. The Fatah and the Hamas are at odds with each other. And as to your question on our side in terms of settlement building, one can disagree and have different opinions about any kind of settlement building activity, but I think it's only fair to distinguish between construction in what's considered the settlement blocks and construction in what's clearly neighborhoods in Jerusalem versus construction in isolated outposts. And I agree that building an isolated outposts is not helpful. But the other side of that is that we've been dealing with this for 50 years already, and in the meantime, life also has to go on, and we've also shown many times, if we need to, we will dismantle and we will take things down and we will uproot, as painful as it is. But if the other side won't even come to the table, life has to go on. Granted, that doesn't mean that one can be irresponsible and just build anywhere. So I think looking forward, certainly as Jews, we have to be eternally optimistic and continue to strive for leadership on both sides that will really be courageous enough to take the steps towards peace, and also the people. It has to come from the top and from the grassroots all at the same time. So we're committed to that vision, and we can only hope, and I'm sure you'll get to this, but I'll just touch on it now. We can only hope that with all of the uncertainty and maybe even nervousness with the new administration and uncertainty about what's going to be here, we can only hope that with a new approach and new players dealing with this, and perhaps with some new energy, perhaps there will be a new approach that can have some success in terms of getting the Palestinians and the Israelis to the table and making some progress that we haven't been able to make under previous administrations and in the last couple of decades.
So I want to press you for a moment, not with any disrespect, but I just, it's an issue that I think is important, and we've had other speakers who spent time with this. So let's just explore one point that you just said, okay? I've been to Israel numbers of times, and it's pretty clear to me that Ma'ale Adumim is not a settlement, it's a suburb, and it's never going to go back to the other side, right? Ma'ale is a large community on the east side of Jerusalem, about 50,000 people or so. Even Ariel, which is right smack in the middle of the West Bank, but it's now so big it's not going to be evacuated. The Israeli government just evacuated Amunah. It took 3,000 soldiers to evacuate 80 settlers. And there are some tens of thousands of settlers who are living in the area that will likely become the Palestinian Authority. At what point does that population grow to such an extent that Dayan is right, that there's no two-state solution? And why did the Israeli government allow that to happen? Why didn't you draw a line and say, these blocks will remain Israel, we're not going to settle over there?
So, first of all,
I ask that with respect, and with a sense of frustration, because I watch those pictures and I can't imagine the anguish on both sides. I can't imagine a settler who's tried to raise his kids in a place being told he's got to leave. And I can't imagine the anguish of the poor police officer who's his brother. They're brothers. They all serve in Tzahal together. Who has to make him leave?
There's no question. I'm sure we're all familiar with the pictures and the videos going back to the disengagement in 2005, and it's absolutely heartbreaking.
Right.
Thankfully, in that case, there really wasn't any serious violence to speak of. With Amona, it was a little bit more disappointing. Of course, it could have been a lot worse, but there were some instances of violence. Although I think it's important to note. First of all, I think it's important to note that there were a lot of things that were unfortunate about that. But taking a step back, the fact that Israel, because the court system, again, it's important to remember that Israel is a country with a rule of law. Because the court ruled that Amona had to be evacuated, as painful as it was, and even as ridiculous as it may seem in terms of the resources that went into it, but Israel did it. And first of all, I think that should be recognized and appreciated,
right.
that Israel did that. Because there's rule of law, and that was what the court ordered, and that's what was carried out. Look, as you know, the settlement enterprise going back from after 67 in the early 70s was encouraged by a lot of leaders. Shimon Peres was considered one of the leaders at the time in terms of the positions that he took. People forget this, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, the opposite of promoting that, and the same is true with Yitzhak Rabin. Mm-hmm. So there's a certain there's a certain responsibility that the government has, because of the fact that even though policies have changed and conditions on the ground have changed, but the government has to take responsibility for the fact that however many years ago, it actually encouraged settlement activity for strategic security reasons, as you know, secure borders and the whole concept of secure borders. But in terms of the numbers, again, outside of the settlement blocks, when the negotiations take place and the maps and the lines are drawn, Israel has said, and we've said over and over, we will be willing, as painful as it will be, just like was done in Gaza in 2005, and the numbers there were more than 10,000. I forget the exact number. I think it was more than 10,000 people. Some 20 plus communities that were uprooted to do that, because we will respect the results of any agreement that is arrived at directly between the two parties. And again, going back to the resolution, that was part of the problem, because the resolution seemed to send out the message that the root of the whole problem and the whole reason why there's no peace is only because of the settlement issue. And again, I'm not saying that it's not part of it. I'm not sitting here telling you that it's not part of it. But I am telling you that it is not the root of the problem.
Yes, right.
The root of the problem is the continued continual refusal on the Palestinian side to recognize the right of a Jewish state to exist in any borders.
Right. I was at AIPAC last year and listened to each of the presidential then candidates speak. And President Trump was one of the people who spoke. And he made reference to the deal with Iran, the American deal with Iran. And I don't remember his exact words, but I don't think I'd be far off if I said he said it was something like the worst deal ever negotiated. I don't think I'd be wrong to say that, right? And that his promise was that within his first 100 days, he would tear it up. We're 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in, so we still have some time. Would tearing up that deal be good for Israel? Would that be something Israel would want? What does Israel want with regard to Iran?
So to answer your question honestly, I don't know, and I'm not sure that we know exactly if we want it torn up or not. It's clear, and our position has not changed in terms of the fact that we think it's not a good deal. That doesn't necessarily mean that at this point in time, looking at where we are today, that tearing it up and starting from scratch would be the best thing. And we've kind of heard those kind of thoughts coming out of Israel, and I've heard that kind of thinking coming out of here from folks here in the United States as well. And that's part of the reason why this meeting next week, on February 15th, the Prime Minister will be in Washington having his first meeting with President Trump and the administration, and that certainly will be one of the top agenda items, is dealing with the Iran issue. It is, and I think that part of what is going to be discussed is exactly your question. I don't think necessarily that either side, obviously there are assessments and there are suggestions, but I don't think either side is coming in with a clear conclusion already in terms of, do we tweak or change or alter or change how we enforce the current deal, or do we really rip it up and start from scratch? I think that that's an open question. It's clear from the Israeli side that the Iranian threat, in our view, is still the major threat, not just to Israel, but also in the world. And not only because of the nuclear aspirations and the nuclear issue, which is a serious one. The regime, as you know, continues to, even as recently, to threaten and to articulate its intentions to wipe Israel off the map and to eliminate Israel. And we know as a Jewish people that when our enemies threaten us, that we should pay attention and listen, because we know what happens when we don't. But it's not just the nuclear threat, Rabbi. It's also the state-sponsored terrorism part, Iran, and I think the president reiterated this the other day too, but Israel's been saying this, and the prime minister specifically has been saying this for more than a decade. Iran is the number one state sponsor of terrorism. It's especially an issue in our part of the world as we look and keep a close eye on our northern border with its proxies of Hezbollah and Hamas. And that's the reason why, on the one hand, Israel has been kind of playing a balancing act of trying not to get involved in what's going on in Syria and other places. But you'll note that when there are certain, what we consider a certain quality of weapons that are being, that are transferring hands to certain people, then we do act and we do respond, because there are certain red lines with respect to those weapons, and that's where Iran comes in there. So that is going to certainly be one of the top priority agenda items for the meeting next week, along with the other issue that we just talked about of getting the Palestinians back to the negotiating table and moving forward in a direct way.
So the president also said that he would move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Yerushalayim.
Right.
But the thing is that we've heard that before. We've heard that from the last 5 presidents. And yet when they all get into office, something gets in the way. So from an Israeli standpoint, certainly Jerusalem is the capital of the country and the core of Jewish life, but would it be a good idea diplomatically? Is it something Israel supports, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, or is it just too much trouble, too much problems?
So first of all, it's really something that the United States has to decide. But Israel, the Prime Minister has said, and it is our position, that absolutely the capital of the state of Israel is Jerusalem. It's where our parliament, our Knesset, sits and has sat for almost 70 years. It's where our Supreme Court is. It's where all of our ministries are. And so we thanked the administration, and we appreciate the sentiments, and we absolutely welcome and believe that the embassy of the United States, certainly the United States, which is our closest friend and ally, should be in Jerusalem. Having said that, we're not gonna pressure the administration on that point. But if you ask what our position is, our position is that the embassy should be in Jerusalem, and we appreciate the fact that the president has said that he intends to move it. There are certainly other considerations. There are the security considerations, and that really is the issue. As many of you know, there's a waiver that comes up every 6 months. Mm-hmm. If I'm not mistaken, it'll come up again for signature June 1st.
Yeah.
So I don't know if the administration is waiting until then, or is just waiting perhaps to see how these first meetings go. Perhaps they want to see how it might fit in to leverage in terms of getting some kind of a process going with the Palestinians. So there really are a lot of considerations that go into it, but our position clearly is that the embassy should be in Jerusalem.
So if I ask you to put your real estate hat back on and tell me what neighborhood the new embassy is going to go into so I can look for an apartment, because that's going to be really valuable, right? Is it closer?
Then I'll get into trouble.
Closer
right.
to the Waldorf or closer to the other side? Let's turn focus for a minute, and I promise you're going to get to ask some questions, but listen, I get the guy myself. Let's turn focus for a moment from the Middle East back here again, sure. Okay? As you've probably gathered, you haven't lived here in a while, and come back to the United States, I think the polls tell us that the mass of Americans are still very pro-Israel, have very positive associations with Israel, and certainly in Congress, Israel has tremendous support. But you begin to see that support fraying in certain sectors. One of the sectors you see it fraying is in the progressive left. Mm-hmm. Bernie Sanders, who ironically was born Jewish, speaks about certain attitudes toward Israel that have never been articulated in public by American politicians. You go on an American college campus, and it's a whole different world, where Zionism is considered an insult. It's and kids are castigated for coming out for Israel, and that has to be a disturbing trend to an Israeli diplomat. So what does Israel do about that? How does Israel address that, given the fact that one day that rock-throwing, sign-wielding, screaming anti-Zionist is going to be an American middle-class voter? And what does that do to Israel's support within the community?
Absolutely. It's a great question. It really touches, I think, on a couple of different aspects. One, you mentioned support in Congress and elected officials, and you also talked about young people in general and young people on campuses. So first of all, when it comes to, let's start with the elected official side. It's always been important and really a strategic mission for Israel and the pro-Israel community to continue to make sure, and you mentioned AIPAC earlier, to continue to make sure that Israel as an issue has to be a bipartisan issue and not a partisan issue. And what we're seeing, for all the reasons that you mentioned, is that it's becoming increasingly difficult and more challenging, specifically because of the polarization that we're seeing here in American politics, especially with the last elections, that we're seeing it become a lot more challenging to be able to keep Israel from becoming a partisan issue. So much to the extent that, and this is going to come up next week with the visit, with Prime Minister's visit in Washington, where any kind of closeness that's perceived between the new president and our Prime Minister, seems to push away democratic support for Israel. And so, this is a big challenge that we're up against. And I think on that front, as I look at my role and my position as an Israeli diplomat here in the Southwest, which among other things involves cultivating relationships with elected officials, it's a real challenge, and it makes my work even more important in terms of establishing relationships with these members of Congress and Senate and others from different backgrounds, whether it's the Hispanic community, the African American community, and others, because there is this, especially we've seen in the last year or so, what's being called intersectionality, which is the idea that the kind of pro-Palestinian narrative has aligned itself with other causes and with other groups that are discriminated against. And we saw that with Black Lives Matter. And that's a real challenge for us because, as you know, and I know that it's very much part of the fabric of your synagogue here and your community in terms of fighting for social justice, which is something that's so important, which is something that is part of what being Jewish is. And as the Jewish state, it is also very much what Israel is all about. And when you look at some of the things that Israel is doing on the humanitarian front, even today with Syrian refugees on our northern border, just last week, Israel's Minister of Interior announced a plan of taking in 100 Syrian orphans that will be taken into Israel and that will receive citizenship for life in Israel. There's Israel Aid activity. So there are so many of these types of activities that Israel is doing on a social justice front that really should be more aligned, actually, with a lot of these progressive young people. But unfortunately, the Palestinian activism and narrative has been successful and has done a good job with the intersectionality in connecting with those folks, and it kind of distorts the facts. So we have a real challenge there. Again, I talked about the elected official side, but with the young folks, if you would ask me, and I think that's part of the question, what I think is one of the largest challenges of my job and of the position, it's actually that. It's connecting with the young people in a way that makes Israel relevant to them, in a way that they can really relate to it and understand Israel and get behind it and support Israel. Because, the bigger problem we have today, where there's a lot of talk about boycott and BDS, which I don't even like saying BDS because it kind of helps brand, this movement. But the bigger problem is actually the younger people that, for them, Israel is so irrelevant that they don't even care enough to be critical. Being critical is fine up to a certain point because it shows that you care. And so you're right. We have a lot of work to do with the younger folks, with the progressives, and that's a lot of the work that we try to do in the consulate in terms of trying to bring Israel to the local communities, to campuses, to young people from different angles, whether it's what Israel has to offer in terms of medical innovation, in terms of water technology, agriculture, and also in terms of the humanitarian work that we do, and social justice, and when there are natural disasters. And we have to be better at that and do a better job.
I think your statement that you just said in the middle of the sentence is so important, and I want to go back to it because I don't want to lose it. Being critical means you care. In certain circles in the community, being critical means you're an anti-Semite. But to say we reject that idea, that if you care enough about Israel to object to the settlement policy, if you care enough about Israel to oppose its government, it's because you care enough about Israel. If you could announce that attitude to the community and teach us American Jews to think that way, you would help us a lot. And I think you'd help the cause of progressive support for Israel a great deal.
Thank you. It's something that I try to talk about, and it is something that I believe. I do think that there is a certain line, and don't
Oh,
ask
no,
me
no.
to draw it.
No,
in-
but
in
we have the same
sand.
issue, no question.
Right.
Responsible criticism,
Right,
and there's
responsible-
irresponsible criticism.
Right, and
But-
also, I think we have to, take things also into perspective when we're critical also, and we have to say, and I'm willing to say it, sitting up here, that Israel's not perfect. First of all, show me a country that is. Israel's not perfect. We're still a work in progress. We're young. We're obviously it's the reestablishment of a very old nation, but in terms of modern day Israel, we're just less than 70 years old, which I could say to this crowd, that's young, right? That's young. And so, absolutely, being critical shows you care. It has to be done, I think, responsibly. It has to take things into proportion. Let's not only focus on the bad, but absolutely, that's my approach and perspective.
Good.
And that's my message here tonight.
So let me pose one more issue in this direction, and then I promise you. And this issue pales in comparison to the existential issues we've talked about. You're talking about terrorism, nuclear Iran, Palestinian peace. This is not nearly in that league, except that for us it matters. And here it's a very simple issue. 85% of North American Jews are not Orthodox. We daven in synagogues where men and women sit together, where our daughters have bat mitzvah, where they read Torah. My wife happens to be a great scholar of Torah, and she happens to be a great scholar of laning, of Torah reading. And yet, when we go to Israel and we go to the Kotel, we usually go on our first day and our last day. She goes to a women's section where she's not allowed to open her mouth. And I go with the men, and there's 100 minyanim, and I love it. And that's wrong. And there was a proposal that was agreed upon by the Knesset, I believe, and by the Prime Minister, to say, okay, you have a men's section and a women's section, let's have a treif section. The milchik, fleishik, treif. That makes sense, right? Or pariv, let's say pariv,
let's
right?
call it pariv.
And another section of wall, it's separated by a walkway, so the more Orthodox Jews don't have to see it. You can't see it from the walkway. And that seemed to be a perfectly legitimate idea, because there's a place where if my daughter wants to have a bat mitzvah, she can have a bat mitzvah. And it doesn't interfere with the more Orthodox guys on the other side whatsoever. And the whole world of Jews said, gee, this makes sense. Even Natan Sharansky, who's a man who knows something about oppression, said, this makes sense. And it got buried. Now, I know it's not in the league of terrorism and nuclear weapons, but for Jews who are looking to Israel to be my country, my place, and that wall is my holy space, this matters. You think you could, fix this for me, Sam? I'm not asking for much, just a little wall, just a little bit of wall.
So another easy softball question from the
know.
round. No, it's a correct question. So let me first of all start by saying, on a personal standpoint, and also as an Israeli citizen who also happened to have been American born and raised, but also as I hate using labels, but as who would be labeled as a modern Orthodox person to boot.
Right.
My feeling, like yours, is one of a sense of frustration and impatience. And I also feel that this is something, in terms of this arrangement that was arrived at, this agreement, that should have been done a long time ago. And it's frustrating for me for all of those reasons that it's not in place. The idea of having we'll call it a progressive, a space for progressive mixed prayer worship is something that should have been done a long time ago. Now, I know many of you may have heard this explanation before, but it's worth repeating because it's true. The Prime Minister, this Prime Minister in particular, is absolutely 100% committed to solving this issue. Unlike prime ministers before him, he has a unique understanding of, first of all, diaspora Jewish communities in general, and in particular the United States, going back to his years spent studying here and his family background. And the fact that, look, it doesn't make up for the fact that the arrangement has not yet been implemented. and that's certainly the source of frustration. As I said, that I share that frustration. But the fact that under this prime minister, this whole process took place with bringing in Natan Sharansky and negotiating and arriving at this deal, it's evidence of the fact that he's committed to it. Now, granted, that's not enough. It's great that he's committed to it. We got to get it going on the ground.
Right, yeah.
Now, here's where we get into, and I touched on this earlier, there are certain constraints with the parliamentary coalition format of government. And what we have here, they say in this country that the cabinet ministers serve, what does the saying go? Serve at the pleasure of the president. Right. In Israel, under that system, the ministers serve at the displeasure of the prime minister.
Right. Right.
And and by the way, it's not specific only to this issue again, which I don't expect that to be a source of to be consoling on the issue. But if you look at the gas issue, there's a certain parallel, and I want to explain why here, because there was natural gas that was discovered offshore, and there were these reserves, Leviathan and Tamar. And then there was this whole public debate, and there was what's called the Mitveh HaGaz, the gas outline that determined how much the state of Israel and the public would benefit from the gas deals, and how much the gas companies and the companies that that do the work to bringing the gas out of the sea floor, the sea bottom, would benefit in terms of royalties. And there was a whole deal that was arrived at, similar to again, it's not completely apples to apples, but in a certain sense, similar to the fact that a deal was arrived at in terms of the Kotel area. And then when it came time for the relevant minister in charge to sign the deal, it just so happened that in both cases they were Shas ministers, by the way. The same, it was Derry with, at the time, he was the Minister of Economy and refused to sign the deal with the gas, and obviously it was the Shas Minister of Religious Affairs on the Kotel situation. And that also wasn't implemented, and there was a lot of public debate about, and they had to basically go back and reopen the gas deal and tweak it, and eventually it got done. What I'm trying to explain here is that the fact that it hasn't been implemented, even though I can understand, and not only understand, I participate in the frustration and the impatience over it. It's not to single out any kind of attack against a certain form of Judaism. The Prime Minister has said over and over, and certainly the way I feel, is that Israel needs to be the home for all expressions and all denominations of Judaism. Granted that without that in place, I certainly can understand how one, especially with the numbers that you described, would not feel that way, which is right. A tragedy and needs to be right. It needs to be rectified. So what I think has to happen, and that's what's going on, and here what I would ask, even though it's difficult, is despite the frustration and the impatience, is to be a little bit more patient. I know, and I prepared for this also, and was in touch with the Prime Minister's office today as part of my preparation coming here today. Even though it's not in the headlines, it's a good thing it's not in the headlines. It's something that the Prime Minister and his team continues to work on behind the scenes. It's something that needs to be continued to be pursued, and I can tell you that it is. And I really do believe that eventually we'll get there. The same way that the gas outline had to be tweaked, it may seem unfair because an agreement was arrived at, but because of all of those parliamentary and coalition system constraints, right. It may have to be tweaked, but the Prime Minister is really committed to it, and I hope that the next time I'm here to speak with you, which will be soon because the rabbis and his team's taking such good care of me, and you've all been great, and I will come back soon. I hope that the next time that I'm here that we can hopefully share good news about it being resolved.
Good. I appreciate that very much. I've got lots more to say, but you've been awfully patient. So we have a few minutes to ask a few questions to the Council General. I'm going to remind everybody of my rule, which is halacha in this shul. A question is a one-sentence interrogatory that elicits an answer from our guest. And because we have very little time, I'm going to ask you to keep the questions very short so that he can answer them as long as he'd like. Please, Farzan?
Yes. Thank you so much. Please comment on Bibi Netanyahu's relationship or support of our president's actions and policies here.
Well, actually, I'll make it even more. It seemed to us that he had an antagonistic relationship with our former president, and that he's looking forward to a more close relationship with this president. Is that your sense as well? Is that better?
Okay, I understood that. I understood her question to be a little bit more specific.
Go ahead, please.
First of all, with respect, because I have been asked, for example, well, let me take a step back. As a representative of the state of Israel and the Israeli government, we don't comment on what's purely internal, U.S. policies. So I have been asked, in the last couple of weeks or however long since it's been going on about, for example, the executive orders and the immigration, except for how it may affect some Israelis. That's not something that we're going to weigh in on. I think what you're referring to was there was an incident last week where there was a social media posting or a tweet, which, by the way, I'm coming to the conclusion more and more that all countries should just take away iPhones from their presidents and not let them post anything on social media. There was a posting that came out of the is this what you're referring to? That came out of the Prime Minister's office that made reference to the wall, and it said something like that President Trump was right and how great the wall is. And then there was some outcry by not only the Mexico and the president of Mexico, but also from the Latino Hispanic community here in the United States, which I could tell you that I personally was involved in. And the Prime Minister came out and he clarified that he in no way intended to weigh in or make any comment as to the U.S.-Mexican relationship, and that what he only was commenting on, because that's the problem with these tweets that are these comments that are less than 140 characters, is there's no context. And what wasn't so clear was that posting came out as a response to something else that was saying that Israel, did such a great job with what they had to do with the wall or the fence that they put up in the south. And so it was an unfortunate situation that caused a lot of grief and heartache. First of all, for the Jewish community in Mexico, and I know personally, as the rabbis, we mentioned, my previous role, I was with the World Jewish Congress, so we're in touch with the Jewish communities. We were in touch with the Jewish communities around the world. I know for a fact that the Jewish community in Mexico was, and social media was somewhat attacked by other aspects of the Mexican community because the comment was seen as as an insult against Mexicans, and automatically the Jewish community was associated with Israel, and so they were the target of a lot of anti-Semitic remarks. So the Prime Minister came out, he clarified his words. To do even more, President of Israel, President Reuven Rivlin, had a telephone call with the President of Mexico, and even went a step further and apologized. So it was unfortunate. Sometimes we see with the social media the intent gets misconstrued, and one can understand why. And so with respect to local pure U.S. policy issues, Israel tries to stay out of it.
Does the world, and specifically Shlomo Schab, recognize that the Arab intransient to recognize the Jewish homeland, is that what's holding back the peace process? Do they recognize that?
That's my father.
You have a great son.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You should have a lot of
By the way,
nachas.
give him Hartman's quotation.
Yeah, I will.
Do you mind restating the question?
Yeah, so the question is, let me try to restate the question a little bit.
It's so great that's your father.
Yeah, he comes every Shabbos this morning. He taught me So he taught me to go to. My father's a baker. He was the baker on Kibbutz Amir in the Galil,
Oh, really?
right? And the founder of Kibbutz Barkai. And then he came to America and he owned a bakery shop, which meant he worked all the time. And he taught my brothers and me, go to college. You won't have to work Shabbos and Yontif. So I am a schmuck, okay?
No, you should have a lot of nachas. You did very well here by
I
your
went to
son.
college for a long time, and my pop sits and sleeps in my shul Shabbos. And Yontif. You made a statement before, which is a very important statement, that the principal obstacle to peace is the unwillingness of the Palestinians to acknowledge the existence and security of a Jewish state of Israel. Right. And my dad's question is, does the left, both here and in Israel, does the left recognize that? And if they don't, why not?
Do they recognize that
That's the problem, and not settlements, and not...
Oh. Unfortunately, I don't think that there's a lot of consensus on that. No, I think that more and more we're hearing, and we see that by activity on campus and by the boycott movement. Look, the whole boycott movement, which is hyper-focusing on settlements, even though, you know, what we say over and over is that the real, maybe not kind of the innocent, well-intentioned folks that get wrapped up in, because there are a lot of innocent, well-intentioned folks that get wrapped up in the boycott movement who think that it's gonna better the world and change the world. They may not realize it, but we think that the real folks behind the boycott movement, it's really not for them. It's not about settlements. It's not even about arriving at peace, because a boycott movement does not help bring about peace. It's not productive. It's really against recognizing the right of the Jewish people to have a state of Israel. But I do think that there are a lot, yes, on the left who don't recognize that, and by hyper-focusing on the settlements, it puts the attention there, as opposed to, again, what I said earlier, focusing on the root of the issue, which, by the way, is why a lot of people say, why does this government insist on this idea of mutual recognition? Right? And the Palestinians say that also. Abu Mazen has said, I don't need to recognize the right of the Jewish state. Let others do that. The reason why this government is insisting is because that really is the core of the problem. And it's not a precondition, by the way, because I've had some people say, no, well, you're saying no preconditions, but you're making that a precondition. That is not a precondition. That is a basis for coming together. I mean, I talked earlier about the fact that we're going to be marking a number of jubilees this year in 2017. Mm-hmm. One of those is the November 1947 partition plan. And as you all know, that partition plan called for, it's not two. Everybody talks about this two-state solution as if it's an invention of, the late 2000s. 1947 partition plan was two states for two people living side by side. Right. Mutual recognition. The Jewish side, which later became the State of Israel, accepted and embraced it, and we know that the Arab side rejected it. And so it's important to go back and look at that, and that's why the issue of recognition is so important. So hopefully we can educate better on that.
We talked before about the difference between responsible and irresponsible criticism. And I think this is exactly the cutting edge. If responsible criticism begins with the idea that I acknowledge the right of the Jewish people to have sovereignty in their homeland. Now let's figure out how the hell to do that.
Right.
That's responsible criticism. But when you say, I do not acknowledge the right of the Jewish people to have sovereignty in their homeland, that's, number one, I would personally, that's not just anti-Zionist, that's anti-Semitic, because you're saying every other people in the world have a right to their home, but we don't. And you're not going to have any kind of conversation if you're starting from that position. And I think that's exactly the problem. So there's responsible and irresponsible criticism, and that's the dividing line. Mark, you have this, please.
So maybe you've already answered this question in part, but to clarify it, what would be the ideal solution with Palestine?
They'd all become Canadians, and we'd all live together in peace. No.
Look, we know what the issues are. There are issues that relate to borders, to the land, and where to draw these borders, and then depending on where that is, what we do with populations that may fall on either side. There are issues with respect to Jerusalem, issues with respect to refugees and right of return, and security. Each and obviously settlements is part of that, as I mentioned. And so what the solution looks like is both sides coming to the table, rolling up their sleeves, and dealing with and addressing every one of those issues, and coming up with an agreement and having the courage to implement. But again, we've said over and over that can only happen between the two sides directly. Not through some conference in Paris and not through some vote in New York or a resolution in the United Nations. So it's gonna take hard work, but as I mentioned earlier when the rabbi asked, we're optimistic about it, even though right now it may seem far off.
So the tradition is that you always finish a Torah reading on a hopeful note, and that's a beautifully hopeful note. Help me thank Consul General Sam Grunwig for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
So that we can facilitate this, because I know you all want to jump on him and get his autograph, but I'm going to ask everybody in the room to stay put for just a moment. Carolyn, thank you. Sam,
Thank you, Rabbi.
Go.
Thank you. I want to thank you all and wish you a Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat
Good
Shira. And even
Shabbos,
though it's
yeah.
Shabbat Shira, I'm not going to sing for you.
Go ahead.
But thank you. Thank you very much. It was really great visiting with you.
Nesiya Tova. Take care. Thank you so much. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, next week we'll have Professor Glazer talking to us about Israeli literature. Please come back, and then the following week, Zionism today and tomorrow. Have a good night. Get a brownie for the road.